What's going on, everyone? Tyrone May here, Himalaya ride enthusiast and entrepreneur. I'm back here once again as I bring you chapter 10 from my book, The Himalaya, where the strobe flashes and the mirror ball spins. Basically, my book's about my story on how my fascination with the Himalaya ride started, which leads me to my journey to one day call one of those classic rides of my very own. If you'd like to purchase your copy, you can get it on Amazon or my online store where you can get some Himalaya fan-based merch along with my clothing line, Switz Gear. Web address is shown below the screen. So without further ado, I'm going to read you chapter 10 from my book titled My Himalaya Masterpiece. July was finally here and Fair Week wasn't too far away. Commercials about the upcoming fair started airing, usually during the 6 and 7 o'clock news. Days later, information about the fair was printed in the newspaper where I happened to catch a photo of my friend Joe, who was helping to set up the Himalaya. I was so envious of him, but at the same time, I was very happy to know that the Himalaya was there for another great summer. Unlike the previous year, I made my visit on opening night. When we arrived at the fair, the Himalaya was staying in its usual spot, just like every year. As I walked closer to the Himalaya, I looked over to the ride and I heard the operator on the microphone while he was cranking up the ride to its fullest speed. Now, I noticed the tunnel was up, but there was no strobe light flashing nor any kind of special sound effects coming from the ride. Regardless, I loved that ride just the same, and I was happy it was there for another year. I immediately spotted Joe working the platforms and helping the customers to their seats. He looked my way and waved as I got closer to the ride. Afterwards, my mother and my stepfather let me go off to start my night. I started to head towards the ticket booth. In between rides, I walked around the midway where I spotted the rival Music Express, and I noticed every part of the ride was intact. Strobes, fog machines, and everything was on that ride, which to me didn't seem fair to the Himalaya, which had been there longer. The only lighting the Himalaya had that year was just the white boarding lights and the 2 spotlights for the mirror ball. But still, the Himalaya looked like $1 million to me. After I left the Music Express, I grabbed some tickets and headed towards the Himalaya, where I got in line. During the wait, I couldn't help but wonder if they were going to let me ride by myself or if they were going back to place me with someone. After the previous ride cycle ended, it was time for the next load of riders to board the ride. I gave the work on my tickets as Joe stood at the other side of the ride. Well, this other guy happened to place me with not 1 but 2 people where I sat on the outside of the car. I had just ridden the Himalaya in Ocean City with 2 people where I was on the outside of the car, but now we're talking about the fair's Himalaya, the mother of all Himalayas, which went a whole lot faster. So right then and there, I knew I was in for a fun and painful ride. As soon as the white boarding lights went off and the mirror ball spotlights came on, the ride immediately began. Seconds later, it started speeding up faster and faster by the minute. The operator took the microphone and says, "Does everybody want to go faster?" Screams of "yeah" and some loud whistling came from the riders. The operator continued his famous act as he cranked up the speed. "Yeah, that's right. Everybody hang on tight. Yeah, go. Now stop to the top super fast." The Himalaya whipped us around the undulating circular track at lightning speed, while it continued getting painfully squashed by the other 2 riders the ride worker had stuck me with. The operator sped the ride up at least 4 times before the ride finally ended, but as the ride came to a complete stop, the 2 other riders took the time to scoot over to the other side of the car so I could unfold myself before departing the ride. Minutes later, I decided to ride it again, hoping to have a less painful experience, or maybe have a chance to ride it alone this time. But instead, the same worker placed me with another rider. This time I ended up riding with a slightly obese 12-year-old who happened to be sitting on the inside of the car simply because I was taller, so I had to sit on the outside of the car for the second time in a row. Even though I was having such a time getting squeezed half to death on the Himalaya, I still had a fun experience that evening. After my last ride on the mighty Himalaya, it was time to call it a night. As we were leaving the fair, I had already started thinking about the next time I planned to visit the fair, whenever that would be. We usually go back to the fair on the special wristband days, which always land on the following week, but I missed out on those days during the last year's fair, and unfortunately, I ended up going through the same ordeal that year due to the weather. A couple of days later, I had my father pick me up from home to go to his house for a couple of hours, even though it wasn't my weekend to stay up there. But I was bored and wanted to get out of the house for a while. Later that day, my father was making plans to take everyone to the fair later that evening, and I was welcome to come along. I, of course, could never turn down an invitation to the fair of all places, so I was raring to go. Until an hour later, the phone rang. It ended up being my mother wanting me to come back home to babysit my brother for the evening, so my father took me back home minutes later. I became pretty upset that I wouldn't be joining them at the fair until he started mentioning that he hadn't decided whether they were going to the fair later that evening or another time. On that following Monday, my family had plans to go back to the fair for the famous wristband day, but unfortunately due to the heavy rain, we had to cancel our trip, which didn't sit really well with me, and soon everything went from bad to worse. After the rain stopped for a while, my father showed up at the house, wanting me to come outside to talk to me about something. He ended up coming over just to tell me that they had gone to the fair that night, which had me livid. I thought to myself, why couldn't he just tell me this over the phone instead of coming all the way down here to tell me this? I was trying to keep my cool, at least until he left. My father then told me that he would stop by on Friday to pick me up for the weekend. As soon as we said our goodbyes, he went back to his car and started to drive off. After my father left, I stormed back into the house, slammed the door, and headed straight to my room as I muttered every four-letter word in the book. Seconds later, my mother came in and asked me if everything was all right. I told her what just happened. She then decided to make a slight change of plans for my weekend. So instead of spending my usual weekend over at my father's house, she made plans to take me back to the fair on the last day, which was during the same Saturday I was supposed to stay at my father's. I knew it would not sit well with them, but hey, they had their fun that weekend. Now it's my turn to do the same. So on that warm, clear Saturday evening, my mother and stepfather took me back to the fair and let me go off on my own. It wasn't as good as driving there myself, but I made the best of it, and it turned out to be the perfect evening. Not only did I go on almost every ride at the whole fair, but I spent most of my time at the Himalaya, which I rode 10 times that evening. But the best part was they never replaced me with anybody this time. With as much time as I spent at the Himalaya, I was hoping to meet the famous operator who ran the ride while talking junk on the microphone. I just wanted to introduce myself and tell him how cool he was, but I was still too intimidated by him simply because I really didn't know how he would react even if I attempted to get his attention. After I spent my last tickets on the Himalaya, my mother and stepfather met up with me as the fair started to wind down for the last time that year. I took my last look at the Himalaya, and as we started heading towards the car, I was hoping to be back the following year for another great summer. A few days later, after the perfect weekend, I got a phone call from my father, who was very upset with me simply because I ditched my weekend with him and the other guys just to go back to the fair. It didn't really faze me at all. As I said before, if they could have their fun, so could I. And besides, I was willing to take any chance for a ride on the Himalaya because to me, the Himalaya had always come first, and it still does to this day. After the rest of the month of July came to an end, my father and Cheryl had planned another trip to Ocean City, Maryland. This time when we all went, I was the only one getting on the rides because Sharice and Antonio didn't really feel like riding on anything that day, so I figured, hey, more fun for me. I, of course, spent most of my time on the Himalaya to make up for the last time we visited the resort town. The Himalaya trippers looked brilliant that evening, with all of its detailed lights brightening up the whole entire ride. The color wheels were shining brightly on the tunnel, changing the painted scenery many colors. The spotlights were shining on both the main mirror ball and the second hanging mirror ball, which made the whole ride sparkle like diamonds. The flashing snowflake decor hanging over the tunnel was in perfect shape, with the strobe light flashing brightly in the tunnel as the Himalaya whisked around the undulating circular track. It could have been my imagination, but I think the Himalaya went just a little faster than usual, which was always a plus. Afterwards, we all started heading to the pier just to look around. As soon as we arrived at the pier, I showed them the new Crazy Dance ride. I began telling them about the last time we were there when I wanted to try it out. While we were all together, I made sure that I kept track of the time so that way I wouldn't make that same boneheaded mistake from our last visit. Trust me, after that ordeal I dealt with during that long drive home, I've definitely learned my lesson. This time I made sure I had enough time to do some more riding before we all left. However, the last ride happened to be the Rival Hurricane, where the ride's operator played Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen at the time I was on the ride. This happened to be the last time I actually rode this ride, basically because I always spent more time on the Himalaya trippers, which I still do to this very day. During the entire ride cycle, I looked over to make sure that Sharice and Antonio were still around, which they were. While I was on the ride, Sharice and Antonio were playing some of the games and buying some souvenirs to take home. After the ride cycle ended, I immediately met up with Sharice and Antonio just in the nick of time as my father met us, telling us it was time to leave. So we all went back to the car and started to leave the resort town. As we were leaving, we rode past Trippers and I took my last look at the Himalaya, which looked just as beautiful as ever. Even from far away, it was still a sight to see as it lit up the whole park on that warm, glorious Sunday night. During the ride home, I started playing around with some brilliant ideas for a new Himalaya model, which would finally make it look and perform just like the real thing. However, I didn't begin working on this newly ideal model until the spring of that following year. At first, I felt like I was getting too old to build models after the last one I had built. I was 16 going on 17 that next year, but these wonderful ideas for a new and improved model just kept flowing in my mind so much that I just couldn't bear to give up such a great talent. So during that spring of 1996, I started working on a brand new model. For the first time ever, I actually figured out an idea how to design an actual three-heeled undulating track with the cardboard paper, which would sit on the outside of the turntable, so when the turntable turned on, the arms would make the seats coast up and down the track, along with the mirror ball spinning in the opposite direction, just like the real thing. I now started using some of the pieces from a Connects building set for the arms, where the seats would be attached to. I took more time than before on this model, especially with the cars. I usually drew the cars out a certain way so I could just cut them out and fold each of them together. This time, however, I drew out different pieces of each car and put them together and decorate them with glue and silver glitter, which was a pretty messy task. I even took the time to draw out the little skiers and stars and cut them all out and place them on each car, which cramped my hand for 2 days. On this model, I even added its own lighting instead of shining a big bulky flashlight in front of it like I've done in the past. I added a set of white mini Christmas lights that imitated the string of white boarding lights, which were usually hung in front of the inside of the ride. For the spotlights, I used 2 pocket-sized flashlights and installed them on each side of the model and aimed at the mirror ball. The whole project actually took about 2 days straight, which was the longest time I've ever spent building a Himalaya model. But the way the model turned out was well worth it, due to its new details. I was very happy with the way that my model turned out, and it worked beautifully. This was also the year when I received my first car, thanks to the help of my mother, but unfortunately at the time, she was still a bit overprotective and didn't think I was ready to drive on my own just yet, which put a major damper on future summer plans that year. Earlier that summer, weeks after school closed for summer vacation, I ended up getting my first job at a department store so I could receive some extra money for the upcoming fair. One day when I was at my job, one of the managers came to me and told me I had a phone call. When I answered the phone to figure out who it was calling me, I learned that it was my father telling me that Sharice and her boyfriend at the time, Raheem, had made plans to take a ride to Ocean City later that evening, and she had invited me to come along. Sure, I answered with a huge smile on my face. My father told me that they'd call after I left work so he could pick me up. I also called home to let everyone know that I was invited to go to Ocean City after work later that evening. After hanging up the phone, I went back to work smiling from ear to ear, thinking about going back to ride the Himalaya at Trippers. Later that day, my father picked me up from my job and went over to his house so I could meet up with Sharice and her boyfriend Raheem along with Antonio, who were all waiting for me as they were getting ready to leave the house. We all left around 7 p.m. to head to Ocean City. Normally, when my father drives to Ocean City, he usually takes Route 113, which takes no time at all to get there. No time meaning an hour and 45 minutes. On that particular evening, Sharice was driving there for the first time, but she really didn't know that road that well, so instead, we ended up taking Route 1, which normally takes 3 hours to get to the resort town, which was the way my mother normally takes when we ride up there. However, on that night, Route 1 didn't feel as long as the drive as I thought for some strange reason. Maybe it was because I was thinking about the Himalaya so much that I completely lost all track of reality. We finally reached our destination around 10 p.m. that night. We drove past Trippers, where all the rides lit up the night sky like a town decorated in Christmas lights during the holiday season. As soon as we finally reached the parking lot, we got out of the car and split up both ways. Sharice and Raheem went to walk on the boardwalk, while Antonia and I went straight to Trippers, where it was packed with mostly teenagers and adults. The Himalaya was lit up with all of its pride and glory, like always, with a full load of riders who were jamming to the loud rap music playing from the ride sound system at the time we arrived to the park to get some tickets. While at the ticket booth, I just couldn't take my eyes off the Himalaya, even for a second. As we were getting in line to ride, one of the songs was ending, and it was changing over to Crossroads by Bone Thugs and Harmony, which started to play towards the end of the ride cycle. As the ride finally came to an end, it was time for us to hop on as soon as all the cars were emptied from the last load of riders. Finally, it was our turn to ride, so we immediately hopped into the car and waited for the ride to fill back up with a new load of riders. Even though there were a lot more people boarding the ride, I couldn't wait any longer for the ride to start already. Soon, it was showtime. The white lights switched over to the color wheels as the ride slowly started, while the operator started speaking to the microphone. Please keep your arms and legs inside the car and your feet on the floor as we take you for another real fast ride. As hip-hop music blared from the speakers with the colorful light show shining brightly, the operator continued his act on the microphone, while screams and whistles came from the riders as we whipped around the undulating circular track. If you want to go faster, let me hear you scream. The riders screamed as loud as they could, and the operator cranked it up to full speed, while changing the colorful light show to the white mirror ball spotlights, creating the famous blizzard effect, while the operator continued to speak into the microphone once again. Here we go, taking it all the way to the top real fast. By the time the strobe light came on and I felt the ecstasy coming from the atmosphere of the ride, I knew right then and there that there was nothing else for me in this road but to be on this snow-themed musical paradise. The music was great, the lighting was perfect, the crowd was pumped, and the operator sounded very enthused during that magical night. Finally, we started to slow down, and the ride began to go forward, while the light show started to change from the mirror ball lights back to the color wheels. As the ride started to pick up speed, the crowd started to get more pumped than ever, and they started screaming and whistling with anticipation. The operator continued to indicate the riders, everybody sit back and hang on tight as we take it all the way to squeeze mode. Here we go real fast. The strobe light flashed, the mirror ball sparkled, and the Himalaya whipped us around at super speed. It was a great beginning of a perfect night. Antonio was even having a great time riding on everything with me, and we kept hopping on and off the Himalaya in between riding the other rides in the whole entire park until closing. The night started to wind down, and the crowd started to slowly disappear little by little. Minutes before the park started closing, Sharice and Raheem met with us, and we all left the park and made our way back to the car. As we started to drive off, we rode past the dark and empty park. I took my last look at my beloved ride before taking the long road back home. The Himalaya looked so peaceful and quiet as it sat still with all of its lights off. I could even see the mirror ball sparkle as it reflected from the moonlight. Talk about a sleeping beauty. We ended up taking Route 1 all the way back home, which again took a lot longer than taking Route 113. We finally reached Frederica, Delaware at around 3 o'clock that morning. Sharice dropped me back home, and I immediately went straight to bed as soon as I got in the house. Unfortunately, just a few hours later, I had to get right back up to go to work early that morning, which was pretty hard for me, especially when I woke up to cold, dark gray skies and raining conditions, which made it a whole lot worse. All in all, though, I was happy that I went to Ocean City that night, and if I could, I would do it all over again, and I wouldn't change a thing. The next month, the fair finally came back in town for another year. I started telling my coworker Billy, whom I befriended at the time, about the fair and my interest in the Himalaya. Billy, however, didn't really care about going to the traveling carnivals. He was more into the standard amusement and theme parks. He mentioned that he and some of his friends were planning a trip to Hershey Park on a Saturday. Even though I was looking forward to the fair, I started to feel a little jealous of him because he was 2 years older and he had friends to go places with, which was something I hadn't had since I lived in my old neighborhood in Dover. But instead of letting it eat me alive, I just started focusing on going back to the Himalaya when I headed back to the fair. I ended up going back to the fair on a Saturday since I couldn't make it during the opening night due to my work schedule. Later that evening, Aunt Christine, my mother, and I headed over to the fair, which was also the day when my mother let me drive to the fairgrounds for the first time, after I begged for months to let me start driving my car. Though my mother was letting me drive to the fair, I started to develop mixed emotions. I was happy about driving to the fair, but unfortunately my mother and Aunt Christine were there with me because they wanted to see how I drove before finally letting me go on my own, which was something that should have happened a year ago. I was 17 years old and becoming a senior in high school, but she was just too overprotective at the time to let me drive anywhere, which really frustrated me. But I figured as long as the Himalaya was there, I could put it aside for at least a couple of hours and not let it bother me so much. Hey, at least I was going back to the fair, and that was all that counted. While finally having a chance to drive to the fair along with my mother and Aunt Christine, all I heard throughout the whole entire time was, watch your speed, turn on your signal lights, slow down, watch the traffic, look out for that cop, etc. After a nerve-wracking experience behind the wheel, we finally reached the Harrington Fairgrounds. I didn't even bother taking a quick peek at the midway as I concentrated on finding a parking spot. As soon as we stopped, we got out of the car and I looked over to the midway. It seemed slightly different than usual. The rides weren't sitting in their usual spots for some reason. The whole midway was pushed back a little further than usual because part of the fairground was being used to build a new casino at the time. As we got closer to the midway, I was in for a big surprise. I noticed every ride was present, everything but the Himalaya. I went out on my own to find the Himalaya before I started going on any other rides. I searched every inch of the midway, but there was no Himalaya ride in sight. The Music Express was there, where I found Joe working the platform. The Music Express may have been there and looking very impressive as always, but again, the fair just wasn't the same without the Himalaya being there as well. I figured since I went through all the trouble driving there, I might as well make the best of the evening. I decided to start with riding the Music Express so I could at least say hi to my buddy Joe and see how he had been since the previous year. As I made my way to the top of the steps, I was approached by another worker who was taking my tickets. This guy was actually cool and was pretty comical as well. He showed me to my seat and actually shook my hand and showed me such great hospitality. I actually had no idea who he was or nor that he knew me, but I felt like I just made a new friend, and that was a great way to start the evening. Until I saw Joe walking past me. I waved to him, but he never even bothered to look my way. I figured he was just too busy to talk right now, and I respected him for that. The ride suddenly started moving as the lights flashed wildly and the operator began his routine. Everybody sit back and hang on tight as we take you on a super fast ride on the Music Express. The ride started going faster and faster. The lights went out, the strobes came on, and the siren wailed. This time, however, there was no fog, which was usually coming from the 4 fog machines. I guess they were out of smoke fluid, or they just stopped using them from then on. After the ride was over, I went on some of my usual choices of rides like the Orbiter, Thunderbolt, and Gravitron, until I was down to my last few tickets. I decided to go back to the Music Express where I saw the same worker from earlier. He was entertaining the crowd with his weird dancing. He approached me and I gave him my tickets. "Hey, welcome back," he shouted as he greeted me for the second time, shaking my hand while taking me to my seat. Everything was going great until out of nowhere, Joe started yelling at me in a hostile tone for no apparent reason at all, but just to tell me to go to the other side of the ride. All I'd done was get on the ride, plain and simple. I couldn't believe that this was somebody who was supposed to be a friend I had once truly respected. My first instinct was just to leave the ride, but I had already given the other guy my tickets, so I thought I might as well just put them to good use. I let the worker take me to my seat on the other side of the ride, where I ended up riding with a total stranger. As the ride started, I just sat there in disbelief of what had just happened to me on this ride. That moment bothered me so much that I couldn't even enjoy myself, which I already experienced during the fair of 1989 and 1992. All through the whole entire ride cycle, everything just kept playing in my mind over and over again. The ride finally came to an end and I immediately hopped off the ride, where I saw my mother and Aunt Christine standing there watching. Now I guess you have to rebuild your model and change your name to Music Express, Aunt Christine said to me. I strongly replied, that's never going to happen. Finally, we all started to make our way out of the fair, and after what just happened to me, I was ready to leave the fairgrounds. As we walked to my car, and Christine suddenly wanted to drive us back home, which wasn't the plan, but I was too ticked off to even care. I just wanted to leave the fairgrounds as soon as possible. As soon as I got home, I went straight to my room because I had a lot on my mind that night. I went to my closet and decided to take a brief moment to look at my model, think about what Aunt Christine had said to me about changing my model into the colorful and flashy Music Express. But there was no way I would even think about changing it, which I said to myself, sounding very passionate and proud. I had always been a fan of the original Himalaya ride, and there was nothing or nobody who would make me change my mind about who I was and what I stood for. The next day I went back to work and I told Billy how my night at the fair went. He began telling me how much fun he and his friends had on their trip to Hershey Park, which of course made me feel a lot worse than I already did. But I knew in the long run that I wouldn't feel any better if I just let that night get the best of me. I decided when I went back to the fair on the last armband night of the following week, I was just going to have a good time and not even take the time to worry about anybody or anything. So on that night, I did exactly what I said I would do. I arrived back to the fair and I spotted one of my other classmates helping out over at the Wave Swinger, working the platform. After I took the time to say hi, I started walking down the midway. I looked over to the Music Express where I saw Joe working the platform. As I was walking towards the ride, I ended up thinking what had happened to me between the two of us during the last time I was on the ride. So instead, I decided to turn away and ride some other rides first and maybe go back to the Music Express later. Later that evening, I ended up meeting with Patricia, who was the sister of one of the few friends I had who had lived in the same neighborhood as my grandmother. She wanted to ride some rides with me for a couple of hours, so off to the rides we went. We eventually got on the Music Express, where I looked for the worker that had greeted me the last time I was there, but he wasn't present that night. Personally, I had hoped that he would be there, so maybe I could start the first ride on a good note, but he just wasn't around. However, things were actually going great so far, even though the fair itself just wasn't the same without the Himalaya. But at least I had someone to hang out with, which is something that rarely happened, and I even forgot about my last visit at the fair, well, at least for the night. After a few more rides, Patricia met up with some of her friends, so we parted ways. I went on to continue the rest of my night doing some serious riding. I was feeling good so far about how my night was going, so I decided to go back to the Music Express and waited in line. As soon as I reached the stairs, Joe came by and greeted the kid standing behind me, shaking his hand and everything. Now I could have taken offense about the whole thing, but I had chosen not to. Instead, I just turned away and continued to wait in line until it was time for me to ride. As the last load of rides departed, the line started moving, and I was part of the next load to board the ride. I finally reached the top of the stairs. I showed him my armband and tried to find a seat, but unfortunately, most of the cars were already full when I reached the platform. One of the workers came to me and placed me with some other riders. He said to me in a rude voice, "You have to come with me. You know you can't ride by yourself." Personally, I had no idea what I had done to deserve such an unusual experience, but this is the second time that year that it happened to me. Minutes later, the ride finally started. We all went round and round on the Music Express, along with me getting totally smashed by the other riders I've been placed with. The ride finally came to a complete stop, and I was done riding for the evening, even though I still had plenty of tickets left. As I walked slowly down the midway, thinking about why I had such a crappy experience at the fair that year, Sharice's boyfriend, Raheem, suddenly showed up out of nowhere with some great news. He informed me that he had just talked with the lady from the fair about the Himalaya and why I was absent that year. The carnival had traded their ride for a brand new one, but the manufacturer where they purchased their previous one was still working on the ride, so it couldn't make it to the fair in time. So the fair will be back with their new Himalaya ride that following year. After hearing about a brand new Himalaya ride making its way to the fairgrounds during the following year, I became ecstatic and didn't even care about anything else, nor the rough time I just had. My mind automatically focused on next year's fair and seeing this brand spanking new Himalaya, and I couldn't wait. I met back up with my mother and Aunt Christine, and we started to depart the fair. I told them the wonderful news about a new Himalaya ride that would be at the fair the following year. As soon as I got home, I went to my room and looked at my model with a huge smile, thinking about how happy I was when I decided not to change my model, nor who I was and what I stood for. I had a feeling the news about the new Himalaya played a major part of my decision and my passion for the original Himalaya ride, but I wasn't sure. I was just happy about the whole outcome of that night and how it ended on a great note. And there you have it. That was chapter 10. Hope you enjoyed it so far. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and let me know what you think. And if you'd like to buy my book, you can buy it on Amazon or my online store along with tons of Himalaya fan-based merch. I'll be back here next month with chapter 11. So, as we say in the Himalaya world, keep that mirror ball spinning. Take care.